We were talking about watch out situations. I think we could add to that list your first couple shifts on a large incident, like when you guys oftentimes swap modules on the engine stays in place and you just switch crews. Because if you think about an incident and your comfort level as you work through the shifts, the little things that you don't even think about on day 10, 12, 14 that you're trying to learn on the first couple days, like transport routes, where are the safety zones are, where you fuel up, all these things that you kind of take for granted, but also trying to gain that situational awareness that you learn throughout the duration of the incident. You don't really know because you haven't been there, right? You just start to get that information as you're walking around and scouting around and putting in hose lays. So some ways that you could gather that information from either your crews as you're shifting or swapping out, or talking to the crews, becoming comfortable with the division that's been there for a while or other engine modules that have been there, and start asking those questions about what time of the day are you guys seeing things start to pick up? Are there any indicators? What fuel's burning? What did the fire do yesterday or the day before? When it made that big run, was there anything that occurred that caused that to do so? And starting to pick these things up and trying to decrease that amount of time where you're becoming comfortable with the fire environment. I think what's changed, and we kind of touched on it this morning, is the capacity in the system. I think that normally, like in the Zaka fire, if you remember the amount of resources, and that was a summer event, right? That's when peak fire season, and I mean, there was so many resources from everywhere. We had so many dozers, aircraft, pretty much for the duration of the whole fire. Now think about the fires that you guys are on. You guys talked about going to the Dixie and how much real estate you have with the limited resources and the complexity and the hazard that now builds into the system. I think that's what's changed. I think, I relate things to crews because that's where I spent the majority of my time, but chunks of dirt where you had 5 hotshot crews to put in this piece of line, whereas now you have 1 or 2, where you used to have 3 or 4 helicopters supporting the crews, working out ahead to keep things cool. And now you're lucky if you have 1, and how does that affect all these things? So I think the importance is building your strategy and tactics based on the reality. And we'll talk a little bit about human factors, but really assessing, okay, and I think that's the challenge, right? Because it's a challenge at all different levels of management. The people that are on the IMTs that are coming up with the strategy, big picture, but they need you guys, the people on the ground, to inform them and to say, these plans aren't realistic. I think we should do this because we only have X amount of resources, and start really, and I think that's what's changing, is because I don't think people are as comfortable because of the lack of resources that are in the system, just based on the amount of fire that's on the ground. Good question though. Anything else? All right, we'll just go into the specifics, just generally of each of the features of the fire behavior triangle. Fuels, weather, topography. So, topography, some of the things that we talk about, it's always good if you could go look at where the fire's burning. If you could actually get eyes on at least somebody on your crew, hopefully everybody, watching the fire for a little bit, observing what is burning in, and then thinking about how that moves throughout the day in relation to the topography, really paying attention where that is in relation to values at risk, because on engines, oftentimes you guys are going to be sent to those values at risk. So when you're driving into an incident, looking at where the fire's edge is, kind of making a mental assessment, okay, in 2 hours, 4 hours, 8 hours, where is that fire going to be on the landscape? Is it going to start to get an alignment with drainages? You could look at a topo map and look at the fire's edge and just put arrows up out in the green where it's burning towards, and go uphill, and you could pretty much guarantee that once it gets established in those drainages, it's going to be burning up. Does that arrow intersect roads? Are those roads your travel routes? Where are you guys going to be accessing that fire? Where are you going to be parking? How are you getting out? At the end of the day, where is that fire going to be in relation to that road that you're going to need to travel out at the end of the day? And then always paying attention to the drainages, chutes, and chimneys, like I mentioned. Looking at the fuels. What's the main fuel that the fire is burning in? What's the continuity? Is the loading high or is it light? And this is all going to change across the landscape as well. So thinking about as the fire moves, is there opportunities where maybe you can't go direct right now because it's in a heavy patch of dead and down. But as you scout, you see lighter fuels. Maybe we wait till it gets to that point and we plan on going direct once it gets to that area. Thinking about the time of year and the curing of the fuels. You know, that's why we start to pay attention to the fuel moistures and looking around as you guys are hiking today in the afternoon, looking at the grasses. Are they cured? They're probably somewhere in between where they're starting to brown out. But how is that going to affect the fire? If we got a fire now at the hot springs with still a little green in the grass compared in October when everything's fully cured and ready to burn, how does that affect fire behavior? Looking at the spacing, you know, especially in the timber of the crowns, you see continuous fuel loads across and then from the ground fuels up to that canopy. And then looking, you know, briefly, the dead fuels are broken down into these 4 categories, and they're based on size, the 1 hour, 10 hour, 100 hour, and 1,000 hour fuels. And these are going to be more receptive to changes in the weather, right? So you'll see overnight, the humidities will come up, and then you'll start to see the smaller fuels burn earlier in the shift, earlier in the morning, right? Because they'll dry out quicker, and then that'll transition. You'll start to see it to carry some of the larger fuels. So how does that affect your guys' operation as you work throughout the day? And we have some tools available to us. This is the RAWS up at Cold Springs. Each RAWS has this 10-hour fuel stick in relation to the 10-hour fuels we were just talking about. That's representative of those, you know, 1/4 to 1 inch diameter fuels. And so you could pull this up. It's taken every hour. You could pull it up and it'll show you the list of things. This is just from Esperanza. A few of us went to the staff ride last year. When they got caught, that engine got burned over and killed. If you look at the fuel moistures of the 10-hour fuel stick, this is right before the fatality. They're getting like 0 readings. It's just unheard of. There's absolutely no moisture in any of those fuels. Not to say that people are going to be looking at the RAWs as you're, you know, actively engaged in a fire, but somebody should be paying attention, and there should be red flags that, hey, we're potentially going to see a pretty big shift in fire behavior. Kind of like Chief Niels was saying about watching the column. And that goes into human factors, which we'll talk about, is just in terms of it takes a team to kind of make sure there's going to be different levels of experience. But if everybody's kind of paying attention and making sure if you see something that you're saying it, so everybody's aware of it. Even if it seems pretty mundane, because you never know. People could be tired and they could be missing out on some of these indicators. Okay, so just kind of reinforcing with some pictures, you know, thinking about an environment on the left. How is fire going to carry through a dried, cured grass patch in relative to, you know, a early season fire where the grass is green? Where do the opportunities exist on the landscape? Fuel loading, you could see, you know, the ladder fuels that go from the ground leading up into the canopy. How would a fire carry through here, especially with some wind, compared to the picture on the right? Oftentimes when we're in the forest, there'll be private timberlands and sections in between that will, even if the national forest looks like the one on the left, the one on the right, the private timberlands will look like that. And so looking and becoming familiar with where these are and maybe the opportunities that exist with those treated fuels. And then in terms of brush, you know, what does the age class of the brush look like? This is a picture up at the Tea Gardens, Montecito Peak in the background. You know, the fire is going to behave differently when you have a 10-year-old fuel brush patch relative to a 50-year-old fuel patch on the left. So just paying attention to the time of the day and how all these kind of interact, right? If you look at these are all fatality fires, what time they occurred, and we call this kind of the peak burn window. They often carry about 15 to 1700 is when all these conditions kind of come into alignment. The right is just a table that reinforces that. You'll see most of the fatalities occur at 1500. So when is the witching hour on your particular fire? You know, these are the things you start to pay attention to. And then like Ben was talking about reassessing your LCES. You know, when you start to get, a lot of times you'll start hearing on fires, you know, take 2 at 2, and that's what that's about. At 2 o'clock, when you're starting to enter that peak burn window, reassessing your situation and seeing if you still have the mitigation measures. If your plan that made sense at the 6 o'clock briefing still makes sense at 1400. All right, let's just talk briefly about human factors. There's whole classes in this, a whole L series, but there's a couple different pictures. This is kind of how we gather intelligence and the decision-making process. I just want to talk about this option selection right here. It's called the time wedge. And we talk about, you know, when trying to take advantage on the left side of the time wedge. I see a lot of what we do here in prevention, essentially we're on the very far end of the left. We have nothing but time. So we're working on vegetation treatments and property owners trying to build in mitigation measures. When you get activated to assignment, now we're moving down the time wedge this way. We have less options. But think about this when you're assigned to structure protection and you have 3 or 4 days before the fire front gets to your area. Trying to take advantage of time, right? Because there's going to come to a point, maybe you won't be there, but your partners may be, where you don't have any other options. All the time that you had to maybe, move things away from the structure, set up sprinklers, try to get that property in the best shape as possible for whoever has to be there when the fire front comes through. If it's safe to do so, you're maximizing their potential for success. And then this is constantly a loop. The military, a lot of stuff comes from the military. This is an Air Force base in Alabama, and they actually have a place called OODA Loop. OODA is observe, orientate, decide, and act. So that's just kind of an acronym for this whole gathering of information, making a decision, having an action, and then you're constantly, it's a process because it's all a very dynamic situation and you're evaluating it and changing. The other acronym is this DRAW-D, which we were kind of talking, or Ben was talking about before, but defending, reinforce, attack, withdraw, and delay. So essentially you're going to be doing one of those strategies when you're engaging a fire and making sure that that strategy is appropriate for the conditions. Not just the conditions that are occurring now, but the expected conditions, right? Base your tactics on current and expected behavior of the fire. Regardless of what you're doing, always be alert, keep calm, think clearly, and act decisively.